सो हेलो गाइस, वेलकम बैक टू आवर यूट्यूब चैनल। आज के हमारे असाइनमेंट का सब्जेक्ट कोड है BEGC-109 ब्रिटिश रोमांटिक लिटरेचर। तो चलिए असाइनमेंट शुरू करते हैं। आंसर एनी 5 क्वेश्चन। ऑल क्वेश्चंस कैरी इक्वल मार्क्स 20 पर ईच क्वेश्चन. So here is given 10 question, but you have to write only 5 question. So let's start it. Explain the salient feature of British Romantic poetry. Romanticism is a contrast to neoclassic theory of poetry, which believes in artificial conventions, literary tradition, and poetic establishment. According to the neoclassic theory, poetry is an initiation and acquired by training. They say poets instruct and please. For them, art is a mirror and give a reflection of life. The romantic says the poet himself is the source of poetry. Wordsworth says poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It is an inborn gift and not something that can be acquired. Poetry is the expression of emotion and imagination. Romantics discard the traditional view that poetry is a painstaking effort. Blake says poetry comes from inspiration, vision, and prophecy. Keats says poetry should come as natural as the leaf of a tree. Romantic poets employ innovative themes, forms, language, and style in their poetry. For example, Wordsworth wrote about lowly and eccentric characters like an idiot boy or a leech gatherer. Coleridge uses supernatural theme as in The Ancient Mariner, and Keats often deal with far away and long ago, exotic places, and forgotten events. The Romantic got inspiration from folk literature and the literature of the Middle Ages and classic antiquity. They also use symbolist techniques, especially by Blake and Shelley. West Wind and Skylark example of this. The Romantic poets use external natural instead of humanity as the poetic subject matter. They describe landscape and its aspects. Wordsworth saw in nature the power of chasten and subdue. Neoclassic poetry is written on the other people like Alexander Pope's The Rap of Locke. Romantic poetry is highly subjective. They also had a fascination of solitary figures, social non-conformists, outcasts, and rebels such as Prometheus, Cain, Zaun, and Saturn. They use everyday speech of ordinary people instead of lofty poetic diction. The Romantic poets use new metres and stanzas instead of traditional forms. They wrote ballads and sonnets. They discard the heroic couplet and use Fancerian stanza and other experimental verse forms. They idealize the rural life. They also include in their poem the wild, the regular, and the grotesque. In nature and art, for them, insects is not a taboo theme. They did not pay any heed to traditional decorum. Classicism and Romanticism are antithetical. Classicism deals with social, formal, intellectual, and static, whereas Romanticism focuses on individual, informal, emotional, and dynamic. Joseph Addison's Sir Rogers is a basic human type, but the Romantics took their cue from Rousseau, who said, "If I am not better than other people, at least I am different." The neoclassical writers were focused on conformity, formality, acceptance of approved standards, and pattern of behavior. Careful workmanship is the hallmark of classicism. Classicism focus on the intellectual, Romanticism on the emotional. The formal describes static scenes in Greek sculpture, whereas the later catch the transient movements. Keats' Ode on a Grecian urn depicts the activities of people etched on a static urn. The romantic movements can be called a revolutionary movement. Question third. What romantic tendencies are present in Burns' poetry? Burns loved freedom and respected the common man. He was attracted by nature and believed that emotion was a better guide than reason. The use of folk songs. In the 18th century, when the Scots longed for independence and unity, Burns looked into the Scottish ballad tradition both to oppose and reject in English culture. He was influenced by the folk tradition. Burns has two tendencies. A. Cultivated tradition of polite poetry in the 18th century. B. Peasant poetry about peasants among whom he lived. Burns did not believe in any rules for composing poetry. The folk elements are found in various elements of this poetry. Themes. Burns used the themes such as death, birth, young, old age, love, and grief in his poems. He also employed seasonal activities such as harvesting and dances and seasonal changes like snowfall. He stylized setting and dramatic situation. He also made use of tableaus repeating certain fixed scenes. Form. Elements like debate and riddles are found in his poetry. Birds and flower gets human treatment. Vocabulary. He uses simple vocabulary, stock phrases, and formal devices such as the refrain, which imposes limits on language in folk poetry. Rhyme. Burns is not rigid in its use of rhyme. As neoclassical poetry, he used assonance, alliteration, and internal rhyme in his poetry. Observe these poetic devices in the following lines of Burns. Burns wrote many traditional and original songs and wrote 3 long poems. He wrote on lowly subjects. For example, he wrote a poem titled To a Mouse. Another poem, The Cotter's Saturday Night, shows his interest in the humble people. Burns expressed his patriotism for Scotland. He revolted against religious orthodoxy and satirized Presbyterian and Calvinist faith in Scotland in his poem. Love poems. Burns wrote love poems. Influenced by folk poetry, he used repetition as a poetic device to produce an incantatory effect. My love is like a red rose. Another poem, Ye Flowery Banks, present a native view of nature. In this girl's song, he used traditional rose thorn images to show loss of chastity. Burns resorts to suggestion instead of direct statement. Many of his love songs, including A Red Rose, shows male protectiveness. Patriotism is another requiring theme. Auld Lang Syne is called the world's greatest song of human fellowship and friendship. Burns' poetry is based on local people and situation, but the stresses the elemental, the universal, and the permanent moods and thoughts in all humanity. Question 4. Comment on Blake's portrayal of children and childhood in his songs of innocence and experience. The Song of Innocence and Experience is a collection of poems first printed by Blake himself in 1789 and written in childlike rhythm and rhyming pattern. They are deeply political and conveys complex emotion and comments on social vices. These poems deal with social injustice like poverty, child labor, and abuse through images and imagery of everyday life. These poems deal with social injustice like poverty, child labor, and abuse through image and imagery of everyday life, children, nature, animals, and flowers. Julian Walker says these songs can be seen in relation with the development of children's literature as a genre. In the 18th century, children's literature developed as a genre, and it had become a profitable business by the middle of the century. Blake's Song of Innocence Experience looked like traditional 18th century words for children. They challenge and overturn many of ideas and conventions contained in children's literature. They explore complex ideas about childhood mortality and religion. Various ideas and construction of childhood led to various types of children's literature proliferated at this time. The Christian morality of original sin believes children were perceived as inherently evil who had to be redeemed by training and punishment to become good Christians. John Locke held the idea that the children's mind was perceived as an impressionable blank entities different from adults. The Romantics held that childhood is the ideal human state of pre-lapsarian innocence and adulthood as necessarily corrupt, characterized by a loss of innocence. Literature for children include emblem books where animal and anecdotes, administrated moral lessons, natural history books deal with flora and fauna, and school and horn books that displayed both the alphabets and biblical text on a wooden paddle covered with transparent horn. These developed later into spelling and grammar textbooks and instructional books, most of which were illustrated just like Blake's works. However, Black were against these widely prevalent children's literature and subverted it. Blake does not offer a moral resolution. His history elicits a respect of the duality of natural worlds and of existence. Michelle Phillips makes a comment on the illustration on the title pages of the Song of Innocence, which depicts two children standing at the knee of their nurse or mother reading from a book out of doors in a garden or the countryside. The style of the Song of Innocence experience is simple and direct, but the language and the rhythm are painstakingly crafted, and the ideas they explore are often deceptively complex. This combination of the traditional with the unfamiliar is consonant with Blake's perpetual interest in reconsidering and reframing the assumption of human thoughts and social behavior. Throughout both Songs of Innocence and Song of Experience, Blake repeatedly addressed the destruction of childlike innocence and in many cases of children's lives by a society designed to use people for its own selfish ends. Blake romanticizes the children of his poem only to place them in situations common to his day, in which they find their simple faith in parents or God challenged by harsh conditions. Song of Experience is an attempt to denounce the cruel society that harms the human soul in such terrible ways, but it also calls the readers back to innocence through imagination and in efforts to redeem a fallen world. The lamb and chimney sweeper can be taken as example. In the lamb, a child, a symbol of innocence, is raising very innocent question. The lamb stands in relation to the boy as the boy stands in relation to his elders. Each must learn the truth of his existence by questioning the origin of his life and inferring a creator who possesses the same characteristics of gentleness, innocence, and loving kindness as both the lamb and the child in The Chimney Sweeper. The speaker is a small boy who was sold into the chimney sweeping business when his mother died. He recounts the story of a fellow chimney sweeper, Tom Dacre, who cried when his hair was shaved to prevent vermin and soot from infesting it. The speaker comforts Tom, who falls asleep and has a dream of vision of several chimney sweepers all locked in a black coffin. An angel arrives with a special key that opens the lock on the coffins and sets the children free. The newly freed children run through a green field and wash themselves in a river, coming out clean and white in the bright sun. The angel tells Tom that if he is a good boy, he will have his paradise on his own. When Tom awakens, he and the speaker gather their tools and head out to work, somewhat comforted that their life will one day improve. Blake here critically not just the deplorable condition of the children sold into chimney sweeping, but also the society and particularly its religion aspect that would offer these children palliatives rather than aid. Question 5th. Explain Coleridge's ideas on fancy and imagination. Coleridge was a poet, philosopher, journalist, preacher, lecturer, playwright, literary critic, and literary theorist. He started a movement against the mechanist physiology of the 18th century. He also recognized the supremacy of imagination as a creative power in Biographia Literaria 1817. He explained how he had dealt with the supernatural element in his poetry. He tried to give a semblance of truth sufficient to procure of these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for this moment which constituent poetic faith. Coleridge differentiates between fancy and imagination. He said, imagination is the shaping and modifying power, and fancy is the aggregative and associative power. Imagination struggles to idealize and to unify, while fancy is only a mode of memory and emancipated from the others of time and space. To explain, Coleridge said that the Milton had a highly imaginative mind, whereas Corley had a fanciful one. Imagination is of two types, primary and secondary. Primary imagination is the organ of common perception through the senses, and the secondary imagination is poetic vision. The poet ideally exercises the secondary imagination. Fancy corresponds with the 18th century notion of wit in poetry, and it's enabled the poet to put together metaphors and similes. Coleridge plays the mechanical sort of apparatus in poetry, exemplified by fancy which the imagination transcends. The secondary imagination is a mystical operation and mediates between man and nature and indicates the organic unity of the universe. Coleridge's discussion of Wordsworth's fault and merits is a balanced presentation. His criticism for Shakespeare and other Elizabethan playwrights of the great value. He tried to find the essence of Shakespeare's ideas to discover the laws that a great work of art creates within itself. He explained the nature of poetic expression and tried to answer the question, what is poetry? His views on criticism are particularly significant as he also an accomplished poet. He is famous for his three poems, The Ancient Mariner, Kubla Khan, and Christabel. The Ancient Mariner is bald with memorable images and paras. Kubla Khan is a vision poem seen in an opium dream. Christabel is a poetic fragment which evokes the medieval atmosphere through suggestion. Coleridge made original contribution and his influence in these two areas is permanent. Next question. How does Caribel describe the lives and suffering of the village inmates? Crabb portrays the miserable life of a villager to reject the claims of idyllic presentation of rural life by poets and painters. Once a young and cheerful village boy who grows old in this village and had worked hard on the field as a young man. After he becomes old, he earned the epithet of the lazy poor from his masters who had exploited him throughout. Someone he had seen as a child has become his master. His daily struggle for survival continues, although decrepit old age and disease have reduced his strength. He mourns the passing of his friends and cannot tolerate the exploitations and inhuman treatment. He finally breathes his last because of disease and decrepit old age. Another reality the poets talk about is the exploitation of the villagers by the rude physician, quacks, and fraudsters dupe the sick. Towards the end of the poem, the poet mourns the life and death of the villagers who spent his entire life without recognition and left silently without making any mark on anybody. However, death offers the ultimate release from serfdom. The stern words of the masters are pointless after their death. The poets write, there lie the happy dead from trouble free. No more, oh, death. The victim starts to hear. Church warden stern or kingly overseas. No more the farmer claims his humble bow. Thou art his lord, the best of tenants, though. After his death, the villagers gather at the graveyard or for the service and remember him as they carefully embellish the corpse with the worldly objects and belongings he had earlier used, while the crowd waits patiently for long hours to reach the dead. The church bell tolls poignantly with the reverberating while screeching of an owl announcing the approach of dusk. The poet ends the book with the desultory note, all the parishioners returning back to their village, forsaking the dead, as the person felt he had more important tasks to deal with, the refuse to turn up for such a petty affair after all. The poet wants to show the poor villagers' misery does not end here, as its mortal body has to wait for another suitable time, which would depend on the convenience of the process. Thus, the lives remain trapped within the cycle of violent operation in the village without any semblance to social justice. So, यहाँ हमारा असाइनमेंट ख़त्म होता है. अगर आपको कोई भी दिक्कत हो, अगर आपको ये असाइनमेंट का PDF चाहिए हो तो आप हमें हमारे WhatsApp पे कांटेक्ट कर सकते हैं, जो कि डिस्क्रिप्शन बॉक्स में अवेलेबल हो. अगर आपको असाइनमेंट से रिलेटेड भी कोई भी जानकारी चाहिए हो या इग्नू से रिलेटेड कोई भी जानकारी चाहिए हो तो आप हमारे WhatsApp पे कांटेक्ट कर सकते हैं. थैंक यू.